A man's flesh makes a strange music when it burns. First it crackles, then it hisses, then it screams. That is how one unnamed witness described the execution that took place in the town square of Rouen in 1431. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't even entirely sure what the condemned man had done. Only that he had said something, and that whatever it was, it had been heard by the wrong ears. The crime? A joke. A sentence spoken aloud in a tavern, sharp as it was forgettable. A moment of laughter, a glass raised, a king mocked. The punishment? Death by fire. Not a soldier's death, not even a heretic's, but a peasant's death. Slow, humiliating, and public. His name has largely been lost to history, perhaps by design. His crime was not rebellion, not treason by sword or poison. It was treason of the tongue. And in a kingdom where the king's word was law, to laugh at the crown was to spit at the sun. It was not enough to kill him. He had to be destroyed, erased, made an example. Because kings understood something long before political scientists gave it a name. Narrative control is power. A soldier can be replaced. A battle can be lost. But a joke, a mocking phrase that spreads through the market stalls like smoke, that is a threat no sword can silence. So the fire was lit, not just to kill, but to burn the memory of defiance from the minds of the people who watched. He was bound to the stake in the same square where bread was sold each morning. Children stood beside their mothers. Priests said nothing. The air filled with the oily stench of his skin searing against the heat. And somewhere, in a nearby palace, a king didn't smile, because this wasn't a moment of pleasure. It was policy. The man screamed, then choked, then made no sound at all. By sundown, only ashes remained. And a warning: say nothing, laugh at nothing, remember who you are not. This is not the story of a man who led an army. It is not the story of a queen's fall or a prince's betrayal. It is the story of a joke. And what happens when laughter becomes treason? History does not remember his name. That, perhaps, is the most revealing part of the story. We know only fragments. A few lines in a tax record. A single line in a bishop's letter describing a man of the lowest estate condemned for irreverence. And, most vividly, the account of a traveling chronicler who recorded the execution in painful sensory detail, but never learned the peasant's name. He may have been called Jean, the most common name among peasants in 15th century France. Jean of Rouen, Jean the cartwright, Jean the fool, a man with no land, no heraldry, no name to protect him, only a voice. And one day that voice said too much. Jean was likely born into hardship. He would have come of age during a France ravaged by war, the 100 Years' War grinding towns to dust, and English soldiers tearing through Normandy. He lived under the rule of Charles VII, a king whose throne had been questioned since his coronation, whose legitimacy hung by a thread, and whose paranoia was sharpened by every whisper from the provinces. In that world, the difference between loyalty and rebellion was often just who was listening. Jean was not a revolutionary. He had no politics, only a sharp tongue. He was known in his village, Rouen or perhaps a smaller hamlet nearby, as a man who could make others laugh. At the church, at the tax collector, at the world, and yes, occasionally at the king. The joke, the one that condemned him, is lost to time. Some say he mocked the king's limp, imitating the royal gait as he staggered across the tavern floor. Others claim it was a line about the queen's lover, whispered with too much glee. Another version suggests it was something more direct, a simple 7-word sentence. The king has shit for a crown. It may not even have been Jean who said it, but he was the one who was heard. What matters isn't what he said, but what it represented. Words, in a peasant's mouth, were not supposed to sting. They were meant to be servile, grateful, fearful. But Jean's words had bite, and in a kingdom held together by ceremony and fear, even a joke could rattle the throne. The authorities didn't come immediately. That wasn't how this worked. First came the rumors. Then came the priest's visit. Then, weeks later, the knock at the door. He was taken without resistance. There was no need for shackles. He knew. Everyone in the village did. Once you were accused of mocking the crown, you did not return. And so, a man with no sword, no army, no title, only a voice, became the target of the full machinery of royal justice. Not because he was dangerous, but because he reminded others that the king could be mocked. To understand why Jean was burned alive for words, we must understand the world where words were power, and kings were gods in mortal form. Jean lived in 15th century France, a kingdom still staggering beneath the weight of the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and a deeply fractured monarchy. The king, Charles VII, ruled with shaky authority. He was the so-called King of Bourges, mocked for controlling only a portion of his own country. Even his legitimacy had once been denied by his own mother. In such a world, the appearance of power mattered more than power itself. The divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God, was not just a religious belief. It was a state strategy. And like all myths, it had to be protected. That protection came not just through armies or gold, but through fear. Fear of speaking out, fear of questioning, fear of joking, even lightly, about the man whose image hung above every hearth and pulpit. Lèse majesté, literally to do wrong to majesty, was not a symbolic offense. It was a legal charge and one punishable by death. In theory, it was about maintaining order. In practice, it gave the monarchy a tool to crush dissent before it formed. Lèse majesté was elastic. It could mean criticizing the king's policies, mocking his appearance, suggesting he was not chosen by God, or merely failing to show the required reverence in a public place. A misplaced comment at a tavern could reach a spy. A servant could report a careless joke. A rival could accuse you for favor. The crime didn't need proof. It needed belief. Because under the law of the monarchy, truth was not what happened. Truth was what the king said had happened. In that world, even silence could be suspicious. And laughter? Laughter could be treason. Jean's world was governed by spectacle and performance. The king's image was everywhere, stitched into banners, carved into church pulpits, burned into the public consciousness. From birth, children were taught to kneel at the sound of his name, to look down when his carriage passed, to speak of him as if he were a living saint. And that reverence wasn't merely expected, it was policed. The monarchy maintained a vast network of informants. Priests, tax collectors, traveling judges, even millers and tavern owners, all charged with listening for dissent. What you said in your home was your business. What you said where others could hear became the king's business. Punishment was public by design. Executions were not just about retribution, they were about reputation control. When peasants were executed for theft or heresy, the gallows taught a lesson about law. When they were executed for speech, it was about obedience. It wasn't enough to kill the speaker. The crowd had to watch. The spectacle had to burn itself into the collective memory. Jean's death was already written the moment the words left his lips. The question was not whether he would be punished. The question was how dramatically. The kingdom needed a reminder, a visible, audible, unbearable example of what happens when a common man forgets his place. The method was chosen not for justice, but for impact. The stake. He was taken at dawn. There was no announcement, no trial, no moment to say goodbye. Just the heavy knock on a wooden door, the thud of boots on earth, and the quiet of neighbors watching through shutters. He didn't resist. Resistance would only prove their point, that he was dangerous. He didn't scream. What was the use? His fate had already been whispered into being long before the guards arrived. They dragged him through the village square, the same place where he once told stories, the same space where he would soon die, and loaded him into a wagon headed toward Rouen magistrate court. But court is a generous word for what waited. There would be no jury, no counsel, no chance. What followed was not an investigation, but a ritual, a slow, deliberate performance of power designed not to uncover truth but to dismantle a man from the inside out. First came the isolation. Jean was kept in a narrow, stone-walled cell beneath the magistrate's office, barely tall enough to stand in and never dry. Rats crawled across his legs at night. The only light was what leaked through a crack in the ceiling. No clock, No voice, no count of days. Then came the sleeplessness. The guards rotated through the cell, banging on the walls, spilling water across the floor, shouting scripture in Latin, a language he did not understand. Every hour that passed stretched his mind thinner. Eventually, time itself collapsed. He would wake unsure whether it was dawn or dusk, whether the men in hoods who questioned him were real or imagined. And the questions were always the same. Who else laughed with you? Do you conspire against the crown? Did a priest put those words in your mouth? He insisted he was just a fool, a drunk, that it was only a joke. But they didn't want the truth. They wanted a confession. Torture was not yet officially permitted, not by the letter of the law, but there were other ways to inflict pain. They withheld food for days, then gave him spoiled bread. They made him strip in the cold and tied him to a wooden frame to keep him awake. They whispered stories of others who had died the same way. They made him hear screams. Not his, not yet, but close enough to imagine what his might sound like. Eventually, his mind began to fracture. He begged to be killed quickly. He confessed to things he didn't understand. He offered to cut out his own tongue. They thanked him, then asked for more. This was not punishment. This was preparation. By the time they brought him before the court, he was no longer a man. He was a lesson waiting to be written in fire. Took less than 20 minutes. The hall was small, just a single wooden bench, a raised dais, and a magistrate who spoke only when necessary. But even that silence carried weight because the outcome had already been decided. Jean was led into the room barefoot, emaciated, and visibly trembling. His wrists were bruised. His shirt hung off him like wet cloth. He looked more like a prisoner of war than a peasant accused of a few stray words. The charges were read aloud not for him, but for the spectators, clerks, scribes, city officials, all carefully selected. There would be a written record, not of his guilt, but of the king's authority. The accused, Jean of Rouen, is hereby charged with uttering seditious speech in public, mocking the sacred person of His Majesty King Charles VII, and inciting public disdain toward the divine institution of monarchy. The words were long and grand. His actual sentence, barely remembered by those present, had been short and crude. The king's crown is made of shit. That was the phrase that damned him. 7 words, now echoed in the court like a death chant. Jean tried to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to plead, perhaps to ask if anyone actually remembered him. The man who had fixed wheels for carts, the man who once pulled a drowned child from the river, the man who had once made a priest laugh. But no one looked at him. They looked at the record, the idea of him, the idea that needed to be destroyed. The magistrate asked if he denied the words. Jean paused, then said, "I spoke in jest. It was only a joke." That was enough. The verdict was read without deliberation. No witness needed to testify. No character defense offered. The testimony of one tavern informant, a man desperate to avoid his own punishment, was accepted as fact. Death by fire, at the public square, at noon. Not hanging, not beheading, not even the sword which was reserved for nobles. Fire, because fire lingers, because fire turns death into a performance, because fire makes the air itself complicit. The magistrate's quill had barely left the parchment before the executioners were already building the pyre. Not a word was spoken to Jean as they led him away. They had no more use for his voice. They began building the pyre at dawn. Execution was not simply a matter of punishment, it was preparation. Every wood beam, every iron spike, every inch of rope was placed with intention. The square where it rose was the same space where bread was sold each morning, where children played, where women bartered for salted fish. Now it would become a furnace for fear. Jean was kept in a holding cell across the street, close enough to hear the hammering, to smell the pitch, to listen to the laughter of boys climbing the scaffold before they were chased down by guards. The message was deliberate. This was not your death. This was our performance. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered. Not just peasants, but merchants, soldiers, clergymen, even noblemen drawn by curiosity. The square buzzed with anticipation. Vendors hawked ale. Children stood on crates. A priest murmured psalms no one listened to. The king's colors flew above the scaffold, fluttering in the June wind. It was a holiday without a name. And Jean, gaunt and bound, was the centerpiece. When they brought him out, the crowd fell into a hush. Not out of pity, but out of calculation. That chilling moment of collective recognition that this man was about to suffer not just physically, but symbolically. The guards tied his arms behind the stake. His knees buckled, not from fear, but from starvation. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He had not spoken in 3. One soldier took a moment to tighten the ropes. Not for mercy, just to make sure he didn't fall too early. Then the magistrate climbed the stairs. He unrolled the parchment with practiced indifference and began to read aloud, not to Jean, who had already dropped his head, but to the crowd, who stood waiting, thirsty for confirmation that this was all justified. Let this man be an example, that the tongue which offends the crown shall find its end in flame, that no soul, however small, may mock the majesty of the Lord's anointed. There was no gasp, no murmur, only silence, and then the torch. It touched the edge of the pitch-soaked wood with